Hello, I'm the Game Professor, and welcome to Games as Lit 101. Today's topic is one that I've touched on in a previous episode about Dragon Age 2, but I've wanted to go more in depth on it for a while now, so here we are. Video games have long experimented with the idea of multiple endings, branching narratives, and all the different ways a player can change the outcome of a game's story. And of course, as the medium has matured and we've become more conscious of the stories that games tell, those experiments have broadened significantly in variety and scope. A decade or two ago, the whole concept of changing a game's story tended to be referred to simply by the term multiple endings, because really that's all that tended to matter, the way the game's ending would change based on the decisions you made or how you played the game. But since then, our efforts have become a little more comprehensive and far more widely varied than that. But there's one idea that really seems to have stuck around from that era of gaming. We tend to judge the value of the choices we make in these games based on the degree to which they alter the events of a game's story. And in the context of more numerous and nuanced approaches to interactive storytelling, I'm not entirely sure that's the best way to go about it. This is going to be a major oversimplification here, but for the purposes of this discussion, we'll say that there are two general types of narrative choices that games tend to have you make. One type will have major effects on the events of the story, requiring the game to include a few various possibilities and different outcomes of certain situations so that the game can adjust based on the choices you made. But another type of choice will have very little, if any, effect on the actual events of the game's story, but can still play a role in informing your perception of that story, the characters, or even yourself, and those choices are also very important. We'll look at a theoretical example to illustrate, and we'll go with something that gamers are already quite familiar with. The zombie apocalypse is upon you. When it first starts, your protagonist has two friends over and they both end up in danger. You only have time to save one. Now typically the expectation is that whichever character we choose to save will survive and be with us for the rest of the game, and whichever character we don't choose will die in that scene. Now, there are a number of different ways this could change the story moving forward, but given the realities of game production, the only major difference tends to be which of those two characters is still alive and involved in the story afterwards. But it's a tangible change. Our decision changed who lived and who died, and that kind of noticeable effect on the story is what we tend to expect from games that give us these kinds of choices. Our protagonist, of course, would likely have some level of survivor's guilt, especially since it was their choice that resulted in their friend's death. But ultimately, whichever choice was made, the effect on our protagonist would be essentially the same. They had to make a difficult choice. It resulted in the death of a friend, and they're going to need to deal with that reality. You, the player, have changed the story, but the effect on the main character is essentially the same regardless of how you chose to change it. But let's try something a little different. Our protagonist has friends over, zombies break in, have to choose which to save. But instead of letting the player save whichever they want, one of the friends will always die, no matter what. You can try to save either of them, but one of them can save themselves, and the other will die even if the player tries to help them. The same friend survives no matter what you do. Now, of course, this would normally be looked down upon. The game makes it seem like you have a choice, but you really don't. Regardless of who you choose to save, one person's going to live, the other person is going to die. You don't actually have a choice in the matter. So, in other words, your choices don't actually matter in this game. But I don't think that's quite true. Let's work through the consequences of this scenario. If the player chooses to save the friend who will live regardless, then we have essentially the same situation as before. Survivor's guilt, sadness at the loss of the other friend, all that stuff. But if the player chooses to save the friend who can't be saved, and of course inevitably fails to actually save them, the effects on the protagonist of this game are a lot different. The protagonist would be plagued with thoughts of inadequacy and disempowerment. They failed to save their friend, and that will haunt them. To make matters worse, the surviving friend saw them choose to help the other person instead of them. What will that do to their relationship? There's a lot of interesting character stuff to explore there. And even if the game doesn't go into these issues, it still has a pretty big effect on how you end up viewing the character you're playing. How you treat the other characters in the game, how highly you value the lives of the people around you, who you side with in arguments. These kinds of decisions shape who your character is, even if they don't actually change the events of the story. Now, in some stories, that doesn't work so well. Games like Quantum Break, Mass Effect, and Chrono Trigger place a lot of the value of their branching narrative paths on the different events that can come out of them. But other games, like Life is Strange, Telltale's Walking Dead, and even to some extent BioWare's games like Dragon Age and Mass Effect, are more about their characters. Even if a choice doesn't affect the events of the narrative, it can have a really huge effect on how you view your character and the characters surrounding you. And in a lot of good stories, that's way more important. But that's not a particularly popular outlook, and I think much of the reason is because we still tend to regard choice in video games as something of an element of power fantasy. We want to change things, and we want to see the world shift and change around us based on the decisions we made and the things that we did. If the world doesn't change, if we don't have a tangible and visible effect on what happens in the game, we don't see the point of it. But stories are more complex than that, and more varied. Epic adventures where we decide the fate of the world are awesome, but so are quieter, more intimate stories about normal people and real issues, and those aren't so often about how the world changes, so much as about how people change. And that often requires a bit more of a subtle touch. So if you agree, then awesome. I hope you click the subscribe button down there, as well as check the description for links to Games as Lit 101 on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. And if you disagree, then you can feel free to tell me why in the comments. Next week, we'll be talking about what constitutes a game, and how we can shift perspectives a little to make that discussion a little more productive than it currently tends to be. And the week after that, I'll be giving the full literary analysis treatment to a rather unique romantic visual novel, Hautiful Boyfriend. So, until next week, class dismissed.